Daddy, I'm tired. The little girl in the red pants and the green blouse sighed fretfully. Can't we stop? Not yet, honey. He was a big, broad-shouldered man in a worn and scruffed corduroy jacket and plain broad twill slacks. He and the little girl were holding hands and walking up Third Avenue in New York City, walking fast, almost running. He looked back over his shoulder, and the green car was still there, crawling along slowly in the curbside lane. Firestarter, published in 1980, reminds a bit of an odd duck in the hall of Stephen King's vast work. It's not quite horror, not quite science fiction. And while it's a very good thriller that will make you more than a little paranoid about anyone in a lab coat or wearing dark glasses, it's also one of the most forgotten of his early works. It is also, in my opinion, the source of one of the better early adaptations of King's novels to cinema, by Dino De Laurentiis with a very young Drew Barrymore in the lead role, but that movie also tends to be forgotten by people when talking about King's movies. Maybe because it breaks the narrative of the terrible early King's movies, or because it was not as groundbreaking as, say, The Shining. But the end is that, well, it is often ignored. It's quite funny now, with hindsight, to read a novel that deals a lot with the disappointment that Americans were feeling about their government as the Vietnam War was finally over, but the long, long years of the Cold War were barely starting. Now, we figure that a healthy distrust of authority figures is par for the course, and shady government agencies are a dime a dozen in every kind of media, to the point that now we have quite insane conspiracy theories running around the international news. But back then, talking about the mere possibility of the government disappearing their own people was seen either as a fine survivalist crazy story or something that only happened behind the curtain, the Iron Curtain, I mean. Now, unfortunately, it's more common, and doubting it is what makes you the odd one out. And while I was intending to talk about the other side from the coin of my last video, and tackle a bit of how King saw fatherhood in his early books when he was a young father, I was also interested in seeing how the authority of general father figures was chipped away, not by force or rebellion of the child, as it was in the case of many of the mothers that we have seen, and that we will see, but by the mistakes and failings of the father figure. The authority figure is also an important part of what I call the major arcana of Stephen King's tarot. But before we get to that, we have to understand that authority needs to be respected, and that respect cannot be forced, and it can be easily lost. So let's talk about that authority. The authority of parents, of police and federal agents, of the government, of sciencemen, and most important of all, how easily it can be lost or transferred, and what happens when too much power is given to the wrong person. I'm Adalisa Zarate, and today we're going to try and understand the explosive deconstruction of authority in Stephen King's Firestarter. With Firestarter, Stephen King completes a set of various psychics and their relationship with their parents. We start with Carrie, who got her powers with poverty but had absolutely no support from her mother. Moved on to Danny, who was born with his powers but kept them in secret, and when his parents found out, they sort of support him, when Jack was not going batshit insane due to possession. And ended with Johnny, who got his powers late in life, and although his parents support him, the living one was not that keen on him using them. But now we reach Charlie McGee, whose parents loved her to pieces and had to learn fairly quickly how to deal with her growing powers from birth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start, as usual, with a quick summary of the story of the McGee family and a quite obscure government agency known only as The Shop. The novel starts with Andy McGee, an English teacher. And are we seeing the pattern here, right? On the run with his 7-year-old daughter from two very shady men. As he runs, we find out that he has a very special power. He can push people into believing things that are not true with his mind. A small dash of mind control that he got as a souvenir from a blind study back in his college years, where he met his wife, Vicky, who also came out from the study with a bit of an extra edge. The amazing ability to sometimes close the refrigerator door without touching it, and from time to time turn off the TV from the other side of the room. Unfortunately for them, their daughter got more than a little bit of whatever drug cocktail the so-called Lot 6 was. When Charlie gets angry, fires start going off everywhere. And the government agency that was behind that old so-called blind study is quite interested in her, to the point that when she leaves the house one night for a sleepover, they panic, kill Vicky, kidnap Charlie, and then lose her when Andy manages to catch up with them and uses his powers, far more effective than they expected, to make sure that he and Charlie have some time to escape. But even with one man driven insane into thinking he's blind and another one in a sort of permanent coma and later necrolepsy? You know, when you fall asleep at the drop of a hat. The shop is not going to give up. They know Andy has a limited amount of strong pushes and that Charlie is afraid of her own powers. And they will not rest until she is under their surveillance again. After a nasty fire in a New York farm, one that shows both the shop, Andy, and us, the readers, that Charlie may be afraid of her own powers and want nothing to do with them, that doesn't mean that she won't use them to defend herself and her father. It seems that Charlie and Andy managed to stay out of danger for a while. Enter John Rainbird, a shop agent who is so terrifying that even the head of the shop, Cap Hollister, fears him. John plots a perfect ambush to get Andy and Charlie without much fuss, and then a second plan to make sure that, now that they have separated Charlie and her father, Charlie has no guidance, and she will come to see John as a father figure, a deformed janitor who has little love for his bosses, and who little by little convinces her to agree to their tests of her powers in order to get certain rewards, the last of them, in theory, being the chance to see her father again. John has no plans to let her do that. In fact, he's planning to kill her when there are no more tests to be made, but is confident that he can control her since her father is out of the picture, completely addicted to some controlling medicines that keep him calm. But Andy is not out of the picture, not quite. And when Charlie finds out that she has been lied to, she makes what Carrie did to the prom look like a birthday cake candle compared to what she does to the shop. There's a lot to unpack in Firestarter. I mentioned previously the situation of kids with powers and their relationship with their parents. There's also a lot of politics involved too, from the obviously Republican-funded members of the shop to the firm belief that taxpayers should be respected by the government, despite it almost never happening. And well, we could also talk a lot about the weird fascination John Drainbird has with Charlie, despite the book making it clear it's not that kind of fascination. Or about how John is a very problematic character given his racial background and the fact that he's the most evil of the villains of the book. And we have villains to spare here since a lot of people are perfectly willing to kill an 8-year-old child just because she's very good at defending herself when cornered. But after listening to my summary, you may be wondering exactly what I meant by the loss of authority, which also can be called the illusion of authority, and I thought about calling that originally. And that's a very interesting rabbit hole that will also come in handy for future books. Previous to this video, I have talked about figures of authority in King's books, and how they almost always are positive ones. We have Miss Desjardins in Carrie, Dean Cody in Salem's Lot, Dick Halloran in The Shining, even if his authority seems to be limited to the kitchen of the Overlook, and Sheriff Bannerman in The Dead Zone. And we will see him again pretty soon, I'm afraid. But we have also seen some very dark people in positions of power that should not be allowed to rule over a book club, much less about real people. But still, those evildoers tend to either climb the authority ladder or be not as powerful as they think they are. Most of them, like Greg, are just a mistake away from being completely powerless. As I said, that's the thing with authority. In order to have some, you also need both the support of a system and the respect of those under you. If you don't have the first but have the second, at the very least you will have followers that will listen to you no matter what, as in the case of Dick, who was the authority on The Shining, the effect, not The Shining, the book, to Danny. And of course the authority about the Overlook, the Overlook history, the one that we could trust. But if you have the first but lack the latter, your followers will obey out of fear, like was the case with Greg Stilson. But if you lack both, you have nothing, and you fall. And in Firestarter, we have a clash between a man who only has the authority that parenthood gives him over his beloved daughter, Andy, and an organization that has the support of the system, the government, but whose members are so paranoid that they can fold like a fan, the shop, but at the same time have enough weapons to cause a lot of damage. Let's start with Andy. At the beginning of the novel, he's the center of Charlie's young life. It is not just because Vicky is gone. We get a clear feeling from the flashback of a happier time that Charlie was very much Daddy's girl. And that is a key element for the plot because it was Andy, not Vicky, the one who created Charlie's fear of fire when she was barely old enough to understand. We know about two incidents, one when Charlie was barely a year old and one when she was about 6 going into 7. In the first one, after Charlie burned the teddy bear that was in her crib and almost burned herself, Charlie remembers her dad yelling at her that she was bad, that she had hurt Teddy, and that she never, ever should do that again. In the second, after apparently Charlie burned her mom's hands in anger, she remembers Sandy reading to her a number of thick books with no pictures about self-combustion that scarred her into thinking that she would eventually burn herself down if she kept making fires. Vicky never participates in those sessions, only comments on how one of those books was too gruesome for Charlie's age, and thus we never know what that book title was, as Andy listens to his wife. The problem is, of course, that if Andy was the one who told Charlie that fire was bad, he's also the only one who can tell her when using her power is good. Along the novel, we see how every time Charlie needs to use her powers, she turns to her dad, asking for permission to either show her powers to people helping them so they understand how dangerous the situation is, or to defend themselves from the shop agents. And every time the fires grew a little bit hotter, a little bit higher, Andy also is afraid of them, which makes it worse because every time Charlie starts wondering how much of what her daddy said was right, if she really is going to burn herself out, or if she could, at some point, control the fire within. This is, of course, a very important problem that the shop should have taken into consideration, and at least one agent tries to tell them that, but he's killed because no one listens to him. After all, they are a super secret government agency, even more hidden than the CIA and the FBI. Their agents are considered elites, and only a very select group of people know what they do. With that introduction, one would think that they are the evil equivalent of the Men in Black, and are as adept at their job as the MIB are at keeping us safe from aliens. Right? Wrong. Sure. At first glance, the shop are the ultimate government agency. But as we see them miss Andy and Charlie by mere seconds, not once or twice, but almost every single time they come close to capture them discreetly without John's help, one starts to wonder. Andy is panicked, sure, and we know he has no money. He had no prep time because he and Vicky had thought the shop had forgotten about them, and the only reason why he managed to save Charlie at first was because he hadn't used his powers in months, and thus luck was on his side when he faced the two agents that had picked up Charlie from the friend's house after killing Vicky. But let's remember again why they took Charlie that day. She had gone to a sleepover with a friend, and the shop panicked and thought the family was going underground. That's the first show of how the shop is a group of people with too much power and no idea what to do with it. There are some members who are smarter than the rest. John Rainbird, of course, who is a big problem. OJ, Orby Jameson, who did lose Andy and Charlie due to a bad tire at first, but when he realized the absolute horror of what Charlie could do, did the only smart thing a shop agent did in the whole book. Ran away. Twice. Fast. But in general, we are talking about a group who is told many, many, many times that they are dealing with a nuclear bomb in the making. And instead of letting her be and hope her father can keep her under control, just, keeping an eye on her, they decide to make her angry and then train her to be even better at using her powers because they figure that as long as she is understanding who is in charge, they are safe. However, it's clear they don't know who is in charge. However, it's clear that they don't know who is really in charge. Not just with Charlie, who as soon as she starts doing the test they want, realizes that since she is the only one who can make fires, she's the one who's giving the orders, even if they think she's not. But also with John Rainbird, who knows far more about what a paid killer should know about his bosses. The most obvious way in which Firestarter deals with the loss of respect equals loss of authority is of course the evolution of Charlie's views on her powers, from Daddy says it's bad, so it's bad, to Daddy says it's okay sometimes, but I don't like that, to finally, one day I may be able to affect the sun, and God helps anyone who gets in my way. We also see how fast she loses all respect for John when she finds out that he was lying to her, despite having a conflict between who to believe, if her daddy or John. And just the fact that there is a conflict pretty much shows how much of her fighting her father has fallen by death, without the extra problems that Andy was facing at the time since she didn't know about those. But there is a more subtle show of this situation along the whole novel, and that's the one that's kind of important for what is going on in the world today. The loss of respect normal people have for the government and their motivations. When we start the novel, everyone who meets the agents following the McGee's cooperate fully. After all, they are thinking they're helping the FBI catch a kidnapper. Even Andy, in the flashbacks, seems to trust Dr. Wanless' word that they are getting a harmless hallucinogen. Big scare quotes there. And even the evidence that people did die and it was hushed out was not enough to completely dispel that trust to the point that he and Vicky were caught completely unaware when the shop moved in, despite knowing they were being monitored. After all, if they did nothing wrong, the government will not act against them, right? But little by little, every civilian who crosses the shop learns that that's not true, that the agents will do anything they want in order to fulfill the orders to catch the McGee's. And this comes to a climax with Irv Manders and his wife, who are threatened to silence by an agent who reminds them of their many family members, include some left behind the Iron Curtain. Even the shop members themselves, in particular Orville, finish their novel with the knowledge that those in charge rarely have any idea of what they are doing, and that when someone who does know appears, they are the ones in charge, no matter what the position in the ladder says. This goes even clearer in the ending. See, around the midpoint in the novel, Andy decides that the best way to make sure that the shop will leave them alone, mostly, is by going public with their story. And so he writes to many senators, Democratic, one assumes, and to at least 3 different newspapers. However, his letters get intercepted by the shop, who has found them, and is just biding their time to capture them. So they are never published. At the end of the novel, after Andy is dead, Charlie goes to the Manders again, who start considering where they could tell Charlie's story, and end up with no clear answer but a nice set of requirements that Charlie later repeats to a young librarian in New York City. Must be honest, nationwide, and most importantly, with no ties to the government. And the chosen media is not a newspaper, or even a political magazine, but none other than the Rolling Stone, ending with a clear message that those in authority must earn our respect with their actions, not with their words, and not just because they are in power. Of course, it only worked in the 80s, maybe the 90s, because one of the reasons I am a little bit afraid of the new remake that is in the works is that, well, now reaching a big independent blogger, it's a lot easier. And let's be honest, the first fire Charlie sets in public, it will be captured by like 1,000 cell phones. It will be in the net in seconds, everybody would know. Firestarter, despite being, as I said, one of the lesser mentioned early King works, is a wonderful read. Sure, right now it could induce some extra paranoia, so please read it remembering that the shop is a medical agency, does not exist, and vaccines are not laced with secret experimental serums or microchips. And here I was worried about the stand being too in the nose for the COVID era. Shows what I know. We will talk more about authority versus knowledge in future books, and we will also see the shop again, although never in such a big role as we have them here. It's also worth noting that we have a second book with no character dedicated fully to the art. Andy was an English teacher, yes, before going on the run, but his main job was to be a life coach who mostly helped shy businessmen and fat people to lose weight using his powers. So there is no actual writer or painter or artist in this novel. Another thing to remember, just as how King deals with the issue of addiction. I swear, those videos will come too because, whoa, the section about addiction to medicine was a big wake-up call. For now, I can't recommend the book enough. Also, check out the movie. Drew Barrymore as Charlie was amazing, and despite a few issues with the casting of John Rainbird, the whole movie holds up very well. And for you to have a great year, please, have a great 2021. Take care of yourselves and others, and remember that the current pledge may not be Captain Trips, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be cautious. I want to thank my dear patrons, Kaiser Carranza, Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, and Balta, as well as my first supporter, Tanya Pineda. I also want to remind you that if you want to support this and my other projects and get your name mentioned here and every video, you can do so at patreon.com/Adelisa. Write a link on the description, as I know my name is really hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art and other stuff before anyone else. If you can't support me this way, I also would really love likes, subscriptions to the channel, comments so the algorithm catches engagement, and of course, sharing the links. I will also welcome all your questions, comments, and suggestions in the comments below. And I hope to see you here next month as we enter the most cynical era of King's early works with a tragic story of man's best friend, a good dog called Cujo.